Good afternoon. I'm Professor David Currow, Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Sustainable Futures at the University of Wollongong. It's a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here today. Luminaries brings together leading University of Wollongong researchers, industry experts and thought leaders for a one-hour conversation every fortnight. We will discover how research and collaboration at the University of Wollongong is tackling global challenges. Today, we welcome colleagues from the Australian Centre for Culture, Environment, Society and Space to discuss their latest research on sustainable regional transitions. But before we start, we would like to acknowledge country. On behalf of the university, I would like to acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by this sacred landscape and intimate relationship with that landscape since creation. From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from freshwater to bitter water to salt, from city to urban to rural. The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things. The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. I'd like to welcome our panellists today. Chris Gibson is Senior Professor in Human Geography at the University of Wollongong and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. His research interests are in regional transformation and the impacts of transitions for workers and households. Crystal Arnold is a Gundungurra woman living on Yuin country. Crystal is an associate lecturer in the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities here at the University of Wollongong. Dr. Chantel Carr is an Australian Research Council Fellow. Chantel's research looks at how energy transitions and decarbonisation are transforming communities, particularly in the Illawarra. Associate Professor Sonia Graham has been studying the social impacts of sea level rise and associated adaptation policies. Dr. Nicole Cook is an urban geographer specialising in housing research. We encourage you as members of the audience to submit your own questions using the Q&A function. We will try to get through as many of those questions as possible. I'm going to start with Chantel and Chris, who will give a brief overview on decarbonisation, regional development, and its social and environmental implications. Chantel and Chris.
Thank you, David. And I also want to just acknowledge country at the start, and as well as that, acknowledge that we are speaking today from a research centre, which is the very long name, which David read out before, but the acronym is ACCESS. And it's a social science research centre where there's been a big group of us who have been doing research and teaching on sustainability and regions and regional transformations now for going on 15 years, with ARC grants, discovery, linkage grants, and various fellowships over those years. So I wanted to just shout out and acknowledge that there's a whole host of other people that are not on this panel, but have been really important and prominent around the university and as part of our research team. People like Leslie Head, Gordon Waite, Teresa Harada, Natasha Clocker, Elise Staines, Nick Gill, Jenny Atchison, and a whole host of amazing honours, masters and PhD students who are really the engine of our research team, including Tash Larkin, who I can see her name popping up in the participant list just a moment ago, who's doing great work at the moment on offshore wind and transition governance here in the Illawarra. So I wanted to just say a few things at the beginning about sustainability and regions and sustainable transitions for regions, because they're really among the most profound challenges of our times. At one level, these are questions of technology around, for example, energy as we decarbonise our economy. But they're also about much more than energy. The research literature in our field describes impending regional transformations as being multidimensional. We're not only talking about energy, but we're talking about water, land, air, We're talking about country, about health, about learning to live in and care for this place and for each other in a more holistic way. And that's really what we mean when we think about sustainable transitions in a place, in a region like the Illawarra. There are, of course, big projects being proposed, large-scale infrastructure projects like in offshore wind, and they'll have impacts that will ripple out across society, culture, and the environment. And at the same time, regions are being transformed by things like the population movements that have happened after the pandemic, climate impacts and adaptations, the global geopolitical picture, and a whole lot of other forces, bigger forces as well. So as well as these sort of technical questions, as well as considerations of the economics of energy, we also need to be talking about the complicatedness of these multiple forces, how they impact regions at the same time, and these ripple effects that you feel on the ground. And of course, in our own region, many people have experienced substantial transitions and challenges before, what the literature describes as regime level change. Things like the OPEC oil crisis, of those among us who were alive or have memories of the aftershocks of that in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Things like the deregulation of our economy and the withdrawal of central state support for industry that happened particularly in the hard hit in the Illawarra in the early 1980s. Globalization in the 1990s, the rise of global production networks and the power of global finance that came to the ascendancy in the 2000s. We can learn a lot from these big regime level changes, how they impact regions, and really kind of observe and think about the ways in which they can often throw existing arrangements, the status quo, up into the air for things to settle eventually in a new configuration with new patterns of winners and losers. And so I think this is something for us to be really mindful of as we enter one of these phases of disruption now around sustainable transitions. And much of the policy and technical work on decarbonisation, specifically on the need for us to reform and change our energy sources, it proceeds from the assumption that change will be, or at least could be, somewhat smooth. It could be a linear process that we would like to have it happen as smooth as can be. But we know now from the research internationally, comparing experiences of regions around Australia and beyond, that this is unlikely to be the case. The literature makes the case for a place-based approach, which is sensitive to the context, that place matters, the local conditions, the pre-existing strengths and diversity in the local population, but also the pre-existing inequalities and those social fault lines that can be amplified and made worse if we're not careful. So what manifests locally on the ground is we're going to be keenly watching, and it's something we want to have a conversation about, I think, as a community and through the university as well, as we are all influenced by these bigger forces that are at work. And at the same time as decarbonisation, infrastructure investments, things like offshore wind are being rolled out. There's lots of big money and government policy behind these things. There's also a lot that's been happening on the ground in regions, including our own, where we have a highly aware community with lots of initiatives, lots of local leaders, and histories of environmental activism and involvement in industry, which means lots of concerned and technically proficient people aware of competing technologies and visions for the future, and have strong opinions that are informed by their own experiences. One of the concerns I have, and it will be interesting to hear some views about this in our panel this afternoon, is there is a tendency for big new projects to be announced as if they're done deals, and then as if they kind of descend from 30,000 feet to sort of hit the ground in the region at some point, without necessarily fully understanding local conditions or predicting local reactions or realizing that local people, industry, and leaders have already pre-existing capacities and skills, perspectives, and initiatives that need to be factored into decision-making processes and plans. A big survey of the Illawarra, and one of these projects that I mentioned before, we did 15 years ago. It was about households in the Illawarra and the sustainability practices that were already starting to happen in our own region back then, well over a decade ago. And it was really clear that a lot of the work of sustainable regional transitions was already underway 15 years ago in our own community. And it was often households led by women, low-income households, and those living in modest detached homes that are actually doing a lot of the work of sustainability transitions in and about their own homes, in their everyday practices, in their relationships with communities, taking on board new initiatives and those sorts of things. So sustainability transitions had its own distinct flavour here, and it's had that flavour for some time. In a sense, it's only now that governments and the energy companies and the other corporate players are catching up. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Chantelle, who's currently in the midst of a major research project and fellowship of her own, which is exploring exactly this question of those on-the-ground community and household capacities and experiences, the strengths and experiences of the people in our region in the midst of this period of profound change. So over to Chantelle.
Thanks, Chris. So Chris has pointed to, I think, that really extraordinary period, long period of transformation that's faced some of our regions. And I guess I want to just, for a moment, try and tease apart some of the specifics of what lies ahead of us here in the Illawarra, where this momentum around energy transitions has been really building over the last few years, and we've seen a lot of, pardon the pun, energy in this space. So in February of 2023, February earlier this year, the Illawarra Renewable Energy Zone was declared by the New South Wales government. And that followed an expression of interest process that saw 44 potential energy projects, energy generation projects registered at a value of $43 billion. And we're talking funny money here, aren't we? Because none of us can really quantify what that feels like. And that RES declaration really recognised the region's sort of interconnected set of assets. So what has been here for some time. Things like a deep water port over at Port Kembla, the right mix of existing infrastructure, industrial and energy infrastructure in the region, and of course the people. So we have a really highly skilled industrial workforce in this area. So while not all of those 44 projects will eventually land on the ground and get the go-ahead, they do indicate that global capital, i.e. big money globally, is very interested in the Illawarra at the moment. And a lot of this is because, of course, we have this heavy industrial base here. Steelmaking is I guess the fulcrum around which much of it pivots. So we've got this localized demand for green energy and for lots of it. And this is an industry, steelmaking I'm talking about, that not only needs to decarbonise itself, but it's also key to Australia's decarbonisation journey. That is, we're going to need a lot of steel in order to build the renewables infrastructure that we're talking about to proceed with this transition. So a lot of the momentum in the region that we're seeing at the moment is a lot of the talk is around offshore wind and green hydrogen. And these are really the technologies that are seen as key to decarbonising steelmaking, and in the case of hydrogen, decarbonising heavy transport as well. But of course, these are new industries for the region. And in the case of offshore wind, they're new industries for Australia. And this means that the whole regulatory process is still being worked through. So while there's a sense of urgency around our need to decarbonise, there's also uncertainty in the sense that this is a sector that's really having to gear up very quickly for what will be a fairly lengthy feasibility stage. So just popping aside that story of offshore wind and hydrogen for the moment, I just want to touch on some of the other stuff that's happening here in the Illawarra, which you may or may not know about, because we've got a lot of big infrastructure projects that are rolling out in planning or in train at the moment. So last week, BlueScope announced that they're pushing ahead with relining the number 6 blast furnace. It's $1 billion project on its own that will see about 250 contractors on site over a 3-year period. And that big project really builds on a number of other industrial energy projects that are happening across the region. Squadron's LNG facility at Port Kembla and upgrades to the Illawarra B power station that are already well underway. And then if we start to look outside of that industrial sector, there's a number of very big transport projects on the horizon. And part of that is about how we, as a region, are building those links up to southwestern Sydney in order to plug into the economy that's emerging up there around the airport, the new airport. There's a number of really big commercial construction projects going on. UOW's health precinct is in and amongst those. The redevelopment of 200 hectares of BlueScope lands is in amongst those. And then if we turn to residential, there's a lot of big residential projects under development at the moment. The Corrimal Cokeworks site, Wingrand as a development, and a new development mooted out at Warrawong. So I think essentially what we're seeing is this sort of perfect storm, if you like, of these big infrastructure and construction projects that are all primed and ready to go in the Illawarra over pretty much the same period of time, essentially. And these are just a few of the bigger ones. There's a lot sitting under there. So with this kind of scale, it doesn't take much. It's not a huge leap, I don't think, to think about the idea that with these big opportunities come some really big challenges for the region. And to see that as a regional community, we're on the front line of what will be a very extended period of disruption and change. And I think we need to talk straightforwardly about that. It's part of the conversation. So much of the research that we're working on at the moment is really looking across these really big industrial shifts, which are largely playing out, as Chris said, in quite a top-down way, to understand what they mean for our community here locally, households, workers, and people living in the region. And there's different ways, different entry points into looking at this. One of the projects that we're working on, for example, is focused on Port Kembla as a centre of so much of this economic activity, but also as a place, as country that is significant for Dharawal and Yuin people. And as a community with its own set of visions for what the future of Port Kembla looks like. So this project is an example of that very much captures that place-based approach that we take here at Access that Chris spoke about. So that's a bit of an overview of what's happening in the region.
Thanks so much for that, Chantel. As we think about that, the question for the Illawarra on the cusp of such a major period of transformation and growth is, what are some of the opportunities and challenges for the region's workers and indeed for individual households? Let's start with you, Chantel, but we'll open it up to the panel after your initial comments.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a great question. So I'm conscious that I think my run through just then was really focused on what business are up to. And I'm also conscious that these are the terms that, i.e., you know, they're very economic terms and very growth oriented. These are the terms that we're often being sold these projects as a region. The idea, I think I was at the Bowen announcement last week, and I think his words were jobs, jobs, jobs. So I think there's a strong sense that there's a lot of economic benefit coming down the line potentially for the Illawarra. So, for example, one of the two offshore wind developers is talking in terms of jobs, about 3,000 jobs in construction and 300 ongoing operational jobs. If we look at the New South Wales planning projections that came out last year, they talk about 23,000 new jobs in the region by 2041. I'm a little bit wary and a little bit skeptical of leaning too heavily into this economic modelling approach, because I think what we've seen from analysis both here and in other regions in Australia and internationally is that reality rarely matches where we're at with where the modelling is at. And this is some of the bread and butter work that economic geographers do, is in testing sort of how these things play out on the ground. In terms of challenges, I think there's some really big ones on the horizon. I think offshore wind in particular, it's the one that everyone's talking about at the moment. It requires skill sets that a lot of which we don't have in this region at the moment, to be frank. So there's questions of how we're going to get these skills into place in this region. And I think that will be a mix of kind of bringing expertise in from elsewhere, building that expertise locally here as well, and ensuring people who live in the region already and work in other sectors have the opportunity to think about upskilling and cross-skilling and moving across. So one of the projects that I'm looking at the moment is looking at metallurgical coal workers, for example. And though it's politically a good sell, I think the idea that we're going to have this kind of neat downward trajectory in coal and an upward trajectory in some of these other projects doesn't really fit with the reality of what we're seeing. The last point I would just make is that there's also the question of, I suppose, what this population growth will mean for a region that's already in the grips of a housing crisis. We're We've got some really serious issues in this region around housing supply, I think especially for those who are renting or in need of social housing. So I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on our urban fringes, which we know, the coast and the escarpment have high cultural value in the region. So I think that's going to be a very big challenge for us going forward.
Thanks, Chantal. To the rest of the panel, we've heard some of the figures around the workforce that will be required and the skill set, but at a household level, what are the opportunities and challenges as we face this almost seismic change? I mean, Chris referred to the oil crisis that some of us can indeed remember, but this is on a far greater scale. At a household level, what are your thoughts and reflections? Who'd like to kick off? Chris.
I mean, I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I should let others speak. But certainly the research that we've been doing with households over the years, I mean, one of the big talking points around that is that households are inherently diverse, right? And it's sort of glib to say that, but it's true that people understand their own interaction with a process like decarbonisation or climate change, for that matter, in ways that make sense to themselves in their own everyday life. So, the busyness of life, the juggling of different jobs and responsibilities, getting the kids to school and getting to work, so there's a lot that you actually juggle in everyday life when you're trying to make sense of that profound change. And so everybody's kind of positioned quite differently in their exposure to some of these processes. So it actually makes policy making around the household scale experience of this quite complicated, actually. But it is also that diversity is also a source of it's a strength. I mean, it's a source of innovation, if you like, for the region. And so we've got to be very careful not to think of households as not being passive recipients of a lot of the change, even though the forces at work are really large. Because I think we've seen now for quite some considerable time a lot of adaptive capacity at the household scale. And when we did this really fine-grained study and massive survey we did of the population it was over a decade ago. There was all kinds of just weird and wonderful and eclectic sustainability, like hacking their homes and relationships almost, to get in place these sort of interesting little sustainability initiatives around saving water, saving energy, reusing things, little informal community networks to share resources and gift things. A lot of it coming from frugality, like it's not coming out of like being a kind of green flag waving citizen, but about wanting to just not waste and minimize our use of resources. So that's why I think there is a bit of a challenge ahead, actually, for the policymakers and for the corporate sort of backers of a lot of the major initiatives, to really not, don't underestimate the local population and the degree to which people are already quite informed. They're aware of climate change, the need to transform energy, often highly technical people with industry backgrounds. So I think we've got to be very careful to not actually get into this sort of model, I think, of like the big change is coming whether you like it or not, and all we've got to do is just take the communities and the households along with us and convince them that it's a good thing and everything will be fine. But actually a bit more of a dialogue with the community is really, I think, what we would say coming out of the household scale research that we've done over the years.
And indeed, from what you say, leadership from households, not just following. So other people's thoughts or reflections? Someone's got to come off mute. Nicole.
Thanks, David. I mean, I think the thing that we have to think about at the household scale is that the Illawarra comprises really diverse households, and some will be able to benefit from these changes. And for others, there will be impacts that could be difficult. So if there's an incoming population who is very well remunerated, and we know already that there are housing affordability issues that are really emerging actually because of how attractive the Illawarra is in terms of its amenity, beautiful coastal environment. And this is kind of obviously intersecting with COVID-19 and the changes in terms of working from home much more. And so we're actually seeing the Illawarra more popular than ever. But the impacts in terms of housing affordability as house prices have increased can be really significant. And so we have to be really conscious, I think, of big economic projects and the impact that they can have in terms of those people who aren't doing so well and may not benefit from those economic projects. And so we need to really think about how we're going to get affordable housing into the region. And so if anything, it forces us to really consider, I think, our capacities to generate long-term affordable housing within the Illawarra. Yeah.
A massive challenge there for so many people, and as you say, it's just going to get worse as this continues, particularly as we attract a well-paid, skilled workforce for many of the roles that don't exist at this time, but are going to be needed in the coming years, not decades, in the coming years. Other thoughts on households and their opportunities and challenges as we face these changes? We've mentioned the coast a few times. Sonia, I have a question for you. Given, well, it's not even the proximity of the Illawarra to the coast and bushland, it is the coast and bushland of the Illawarra. What are some of the climate impacts that the Illawarra needs to prepare for as we look to the future, given your expertise?
Thanks, David. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this discussion is so much at the moment is about the transition towards more renewable sources of energy. But the other thing we need to think about when we're thinking about infrastructure projects, when we're thinking about bringing people into the region, is also the way in which climate change is going to affect us and how we can better prepare for and plan for that and the impacts it's not going to just have on industries, but also on households. And so we really need to think about like the impacts that we're expecting in the Illawarra. So, for example, in the lead up to this, I was just having a look at the Bureau of Meteorology website, where there's freely available information on how the weather is changing in the region. And one of the best records around here is in Ulladulla, where there's a 30-year-long record on the temperature. And what we can see, just even the last 30 years, that overnight temperatures, our minimum temperatures, have increased a degree in that period of time. That's sort of, shorter than my lifetime. So daytime temperatures are also going up, but not to the same rate. And that's consistent not just in the Illawarra, but right across Australia. So we need to plan for these changes in temperature. We're going to have more frequent, longer lasting heat waves. And we can see, in Europe, the impacts that that's been having recently. So we have to think when we're planning for these infrastructure programs, what is going to be the impact of climate change, heat waves, and the other climate change impacts that we're expecting around here. So obviously more frequent floods, if there's more intense rainfall events, bushfires is obviously a big concern, as well as things like sea level rise and those slower level processes. So what our research in other parts of Australia has really emphasised is we can't just look at one part of this equation without the other. We can't look at mitigating against climate change without looking at adaptation. And we're looking at preparing ourselves for climate impacts. We can't look at one potential change at the expense of others. So we can't just look at temperatures without also thinking about what sea level rise is going to do. And if we do have sea level rise, what about the location of this key infrastructure? What is the impact of that going to be? Do we need to think about exactly where that's placed? Does it need to move further inland? What are the costs associated with doing that? We also have to recognise that people aren't static. And so a lot of the way that our adaptation plans talk is as if populations are static, as if the people that are here now are the same people who are going to be infected in 10 to 20 years' time. And through the conversations we've just been having about the different people who are likely to move into the region, we need to start taking into account their views, their likely aspirations, their values already now when we're planning for this infrastructure. And it's not just residents, it's also people who come and visit the region for tourism and a whole range of other reasons that might bring people here. So we can't just look at the economic impacts like Chantel said. It's not just about the questions of finances and economic growth. There are so many reasons why people love the coast, like Nicole said. It's our beautiful coastal environment. Almost in every research study of the coastal environment, the natural beauty, the scenery, the recreational opportunities are the things people value the most. So when we're planning the infrastructure and we're planning for those impacts of climate change, we need to think about the impacts it's going to have on what people love about the coast beyond the dollar value, the impact on the roads and the infrastructure. And the other thing I think I'd like to point out is that we can't just assume that the impacts of these climate changes are going to have on the Illawarra are consistent across the whole region. When Chris was talking before about that place-based approach, we've done some research recently where we said, actually, how place-based, what is meant by place. And it's not even just a local government area, something, you know, possibly as small as a local government area. It's actually smaller than that again. It's based on where people actually are, the networks of who they relate to and where they're living. Some areas of the coast might be experiencing erosion in a way that other areas aren't. And that really varies even within a local government area. So we need to take into account all of those different scales at which these changes are happening, from the household level we were mentioning before, to small communities, to local government areas, to the region as a whole.
Thanks for that, Sonia. You're also really outlining that sustainable transitions are much more than energy alone. Nicole, you've already commented on some of the ripple effects, but what does it mean for housing, for health, for communities?
Thanks, David. So there's just so many impacts in those areas, and also, I guess, opportunities. But one area that is really important in terms of housing relates to future housing development in hazard zones and areas of risk. And we often associate our homes as being sort of separate from the world and as a place that we can sort of go home to and escape the challenges, I guess, of the wider environment. But some of these climate-induced hazards that Sonia is mentioning, it really means that we have to recognise that we and our homes are part of a really dynamic and unpredictable environment. So it's a whole different way of conceptualising and understanding what home is. So in the Illawarra, it can include planning with landslides in mind, in relation to damaging winds, but particularly ensuring that our housing is not being located in areas of flooding risk in particular. And so obviously centering flood and hazard risk management across all of our planning and development processes is a really important part of this. But it really does hinge on us developing as a society new ways of understanding housing, not simply as we've sort of been talking about in this kind of transactional or economic sense, or even as a haven, you know, away from the wider world, but as homes really embedded in place-based ecologies and climates that are changing. And so our homes, and also we as residents who live in these places, have a responsibility to start to understand our homes in that way. I wanted to talk a little about a project that we had been doing here in the school that's looking at people's experiences of living in high-rise in the context of these increasing temperature extremes that we're experiencing. And what they're telling us is that housing quality, design and materials are really, really important, not only thinking about major disasters and hazards, but also in relation to just, you know, everyday temperature extremes. And they've drawn our attention very much to the importance of more low-tech, low-cost solutions in this environment, like insulation, the old things, ventilation, external shading, fly screens, fans, the things we did before air conditioning. And what we've found is that homes that have those features can really enhance the health and well-being outcomes for those who are less well off. And it also encourages those who can afford to use the aircon to use the aircon a little bit less. And so thinking about some of those ways in which our homes aren't really just responding to one thing, and we have different means of ensuring that we can live in relation to this changing environmental context that are actually low cost, and as Chris was saying, they're kind of more vernacular forms of adaptation. So rethinking the idea of our home in relation to the wider environment, but particularly from the perspective of air, is definitely one part of the puzzle that we're researching to achieve sustainable and healthy housing outcomes. I can talk about air in relation to COVID-19 as well, which is it really had a big impact, I think, in terms of housing markets. So it's a little bit curious to kind of follow this line of air, but it actually, you know, there were lots of unanticipated impacts of COVID-19. And so, you know, when we think of air, we just really take it for granted, but suddenly through COVID, we can see that air itself can be a risk, right? And it's already a risk in different ways in terms of heat wave, but COVID really brought this home. And so a lot of people in that environment shifted to working from home. And in research that we've been doing with creative industry workers, we found that in this sector, like many other sectors, working from home has really continued post-COVID. And this has had a really big impact on places like Illawarra, as I mentioned before, particularly in terms of its proximity to Sydney. It has become a place that people think, oh, well, I could move there and still, you know, work from that location. And so we've actually seen this shift of in-migration into the Illawarra in the last couple of years. But what's kind of happening is that people are becoming, as that more interest, the property market becomes, you know, it starts to go up in value, and we're seeing people be displaced from their homes, almost like a wave going from the northern suburbs to the southern parts of the Illawarra. And at the same time, and this is really, really crucial, Wollongong has been shedding over the last 5 years social housing. And so we're kind of getting this wave of kind of a more expensive housing. At the same time, we're not reinvesting in more affordable options. And so we actually lost 525 social housing units between 2016 and 2021. And then from the opposite perspective, we get higher land prices that drive more land development processes. And this is obviously leading to more densification, which raises questions about the sort of the neighbourhoods that people want to live in, but crucially about the quality and the affordability of those new apartments. So we sort of see these intersecting elements that are really important around the housing question. And it's that question between air, housing, and the kind of social dimensions that raise questions for us as a society about what sort of neighbourhoods and what sort of housing systems that we want to have to support a healthy, sustainable, and happy community.
Thanks for that, Nicole. Crystal, are we missing opportunities to learn from Indigenous ontologies and knowledges about the region as a special place?
Yeah, so I think country's voice is really missing in this conversation. It's important to acknowledge and understand that, you know, we are part of the environment, and that, you know, and the Illawarra in particular for people who live here, and also Mother Earth as a whole. And I think we really need to, there needs to be a shift in the thinking around and the approaches to decarbonisation. I think there needs to be a shift, you know, from transforming and transitioning into a for a sustainable future that goes kind of back to that more ancient view of the Illawarra that cares and learns from country. You know, it feels like there's so much focus on people and human, but not much conversation is being, you know, discussed about, you know, the trees, the plants and animals and all of the other non-humans that climate change and sustainable practices is affecting. And, you know, we can learn a lot from Aboriginal people and our understanding of country, because we're not separate. We're part of the environment. Country is us, but all those other plants and animals are also our brothers and sisters. So this understanding alone, it can create a more harmonious relationship with the land, one where instead of extracting energy and taking, we care for the energy that Mother Earth already holds. You know, there's been all this talk about AI at the moment, and recently Uncle Macca, you know, said to me that is actually not a new thing. This is it's AI began in 1788 when people they first started to use artificial elements, and instead of using country's intelligence, that ancient intelligence AI. And so what we really need to do is, I think, is return to that ancient way of learning from country. And we need to observe our non-human brothers and sisters and how they live in oneness with the environment. And you and elders, Uncle Max and Uncle Macca and Uncle Greg, they've taught me how to look, listen and see, which is a term that they use how to learn from country and observe. And we can look, listen and see at a tree, for example, and you can see that it holds water in the soil and it provides oxygen and shelter. Trees are our sustainable future. Instead of transforming our way of living into something artificial, we need to go back to those ancient ancestors who are the trees. If we really want a sustainable future. And this way of learning is also how I teach in the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities. But I think it's also something that really needs to be considered when when people are undertaking these planned proposals, such as the wind turbines along the coast. It's important to observe, look, listen and see here who travels up that path, because that's got significant song lines along there that Gurrugul the whale travels along. And I guess lastly, the point is that the Illawarra, yes, it does hold a lot of ancient knowledge within the non-human, but also there's a lot of cultural heritage passed down through the people that live here through all these generations, and they can provide invaluable insights to coexisting with nature and addressing environmental challenges. Community has a history of adapting to a changing environment, and this knowledge of local ecosystems and weather patterns can contribute to strategies in relation to sustainability. These histories often include historical lessons learnt in resource management and also that land use. And so incorporating these historical perspectives, can help us to take care of the Illawarra. So I guess overall my point is that I think that, we need to bring country's voice in, and that involves understanding that we are part of the environment. And to do that, it is important to build relationships with First Nations people, but it also involves actively listening and learning from the land and going back to country. And it's, it underscores that responsibility of us as humans, that we are carers for country and Illawarra, and that seeing that the land is, it's part of self, and that really has the ability to harmonise academic knowledge with that ancient knowledge to create a more sustainable future.
Thank you for that, for sharing that, Crystal. We have a number of questions coming through, and given the number, we might shift across to a couple of those questions. Firstly, from Ty Christopher, what do you see as the social transformation opportunities which the energy transition present? Specifically, can local energy being shared cheaply within local neighbourhoods become a reality and help to create more equitable social structures? Who'd like to kick off with that? Chantel.
Yeah, I might be happy to jump in on that one. Oh no, now the question's disappeared. It's all right in front of me. I would say that, it's a terrific question, and one that Ty and I have been in discussion about over the last couple of years. I think, yes, in theory, absolutely, that we can, I suppose technically this can work from an engineering perspective. We can move towards the idea of community cooperative power arrangements. There is no one better to talk about that stuff with than Ty himself, I've got to say, on a technical level. But I would say, in practice, some of what we know, and perhaps Chris might know about this literature more than I do, but some of what we know about how communities get together and kind of power this stuff out in order to look after those who are most vulnerable, I think those are the biggest questions. It's how do we do, and I'm looking at everyone nodding because I feel like everyone does a version of this in their own work, but how do we do sort of bottom-up democracy when we're dealing with a complex system like energy? So I think that is the challenge ahead for us. I think at a technical level, I'm sure we can find the solution, and there's good minds like Ty and Saul Griffith and others who are in that space at a technical level. But I think what is the big question in that is socially, how do we organise for that, so that we're bringing those most vulnerable along on that journey with us?
Thank you for that, Chantal. Others, reflections on that, Chris?
Yeah, I could say a couple of different things. It's actually at one level a technical question. At the other level, it's actually a philosophical question around as a society, to what degree do we depend upon large systems of provision for energy and water and the sort of means for us to survive in life? Or are we shifting towards, do we need to shift towards the more distributed systems, if you like, where we're not so dependent on those singular forms of infrastructure provision? It's a really interesting philosophical question too, because if we also try to keep in our mind of all this mess of stuff going on, that the Earth is more volatile, we've got more frequent natural disasters, our vulnerability to be left stranded in times of great stress, if we have terrible things happen from a disaster point of view, can be exacerbated if we're dependent upon those single systems of provision as major modernist systems. It is a risk. So I think there's a lot to be said, I think, for exploring those kinds of options. And you know, I think frankly, we're a decade behind where we should be. At least we're probably 3 decades behind where we need to be with that. But we can certainly learn from other places where, and certainly in Europe, the literature seems to be much more vibrant there around these sort of community scale, social housing scale, energy generation experiments, but also around other things, food growing, you know, water saving, water reuse technologies and so forth. So I do think that is generally the shift. It's an exciting shift to be looking at for sure. The flip side of that, of course, is that we're still going to need steel. So we're going to still need major energy production to supply those industrial scale facilities. And those, you know, we still need the Port Kemblas very much in the world. So so we're going to probably still end up with a mix that relies on some of that large scale or centralized, you know, utility, you know, generation and provision as well. But it's an interesting kind of, yeah, it's both technical and a philosophical question, I guess.
And very practical. We have several questions from Kerry Ann Christian. I'm not going to read them all out, or we'll use all of our time, I'm afraid. But what about the regulation of wind farms? I think would be a fair summary of what's being asked there. People's thoughts and reflections on that?
Yeah, that might be one for me to start on again, having looked a little bit at this. Thanks, Kerry Ann. I think these are really good questions to be asking at this point in time. So we know that these regulations that the federal government, which is the space in which offshore wind is regulated, it was illegal to develop offshore wind in Australia until the Morrison government passed the regulations in 2021. So we're dealing with a very, very new regulatory process at the federal level. And I think what's compounding that is that we've come out of an era where that federal government capacity has shrunk over time in terms of sort of small government. And so there's a need to work through that regulation with a sort of at the same time as trying to rebuild that federal government capacity. So I think that's one of the issues at stake here. I think in New South Wales, when it comes to sort of the planning of these things, of these projects, we still don't, I think the New South Wales government is very much still working through how that planning regulation will work, and that's very much in train at the moment. But I guess my point is, I think this is a really good space for universities to sit. Unsurprisingly, I'm not trying to shop our services here, but I do think it's an important space for universities and for researchers to sit, to look at what the best practices and what the lessons that we can learn from other places around the world are, and to bring that into the discussion here in Australia and to bring that into the policy discussion. I think on the one hand, we feel like we're sort of running hard to catch up because we've had this sort of decade of inaction on climate change mitigation in Australia. And I think we're running to catch up. But what that does is gives us the lens to look at the 40 years of offshore wind development in other places. And I think, Kerry Ann, some of those examples that you point to are ones that we're starting to look very closely at here.
Thanks for that, Chantal. A question from Toby Dawson. Using the lens of long-term social impacts, How do we create a level of synthesis across the different sustainability topics and across various organizations and industries to ensure that we are collectively working towards the same net impact for individuals, families, and communities? Is there an appetite amongst major players for that to occur? Nicole.
I might just jump in there with a broad comment, and thank you for that question, Toby, as well. I think this is just picking up on a point that we were talking about earlier. It's really important to recognise the opportunity for places like the Illawarra in synthesising these diverse elements, because it is a little smaller, and that by taking this kind of place-based approach, it creates this opportunity for this place that is at the intersection really of both renewable energy transition and of needing to adapt to a changing environment. So doing both of those things. But if we kind of approach that from the level of the place, rather than all of these sort of issues, you know, as sort of occurring in an unimplaced environment, then we can sort of get a handle on it a little bit more. So maybe starting with the Illawarra to think about, okay, who are the big players here? And starting to kind of create those conversations. And so it does actually bring up a really interesting question about the role of the university in facilitating those types of conversations as well. So I think there's something about place that is really important in approaching really complex issues and intersecting issues.
And the appetite of industry, of larger organizations, not just industry, to really participate and facilitate, catalyze some of these changes. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Toby. And I think that you certainly hear government talk a lot about the need to work across silos, for example, in different portfolios. So there's a kind of sentiment there, and there's, I think, an appetite to some degree at least, but also I suspect a frustration that it's still very difficult actually to synthesize in the way that you suggest. I think that is a challenge. And I think the difficulty here too, as well, is that we've got, on the one hand, we've got a tension really between, on the one hand, the urgency, the need to act quickly, which we've really got to do, but also the need to get it right and the need to actually have proper inclusive process around these things. So working across those silos can take time, and it is ultimately about relationships and how they're forged and how enduring they are. So that's not an easy tension to resolve by any stretch. I was actually partly turning my mic on as well because I thought I might dump Sonia in it here, because we also have on the panel here an expert about collective action. And I think this is, in part at least, maybe a question also about what collective action looks like. And maybe communities have got a really key role to play there.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I agree. I think there's a lot that the research on collective action can tell us about the ways in which we can encourage people and organisations to work together in this space. And I think part of it is providing incentives to collaborate. You know, at the moment, there isn't much incentives. And so the question is, from where is that going to come? And if we do work together, whether it's at that household and community level about developing energy grids or, you know, those sort of more distributed networks you talked about, right through the biggest organisations, even, you know, if we look at the international scale about the way we look at work on collaboration, there's a real need for that and a recognition of that. But in practice, it often breaks down. And so partly we've got to address these questions about how do we get people to identify common goals? At what scale are we talking about? How can we draw boundaries around the problem to make it seem feasible? If you just make it really big questions about an energy transition, then sometimes that can be such an insurmountable challenge, and it's hard to, you know, identify all the stakeholders you would have to engage with, that it almost becomes too big. So often the answer around collective action is about starting small and building things from the ground up. And so really seeing, you know, where can we start to get some traction? Where can we get results together that benefit a small number of people, and then use that as a model to scale up, rather than trying to do it all at once across a whole region or for a big issue.
Thanks for that, Sonia. The last question, for which we'll have time this afternoon, is from Tanisha Amos Hampson. And really it is asking, can energy start to be thought of as a human right, given that access currently is not equitable across Australia? How do we build a system that focuses on people who experience vulnerability? Nicole.
I'd have to think about that, I guess, in terms of energy specifically. I think that there needs to be certainly some question around equity of access in terms of finance. So we need to really understand that some households and some community members, as Tanisha rightly says, cannot access the energy that they will need, or the renewable energy in the future. And so again, kind of thinking about ways to incorporate people, perhaps it's through taxation systems or some form of subsidy, to just recognize that in any space in which there is a market, that there is going to have to be some kind of consideration to redistribution. I really like the idea of energy as a human right, and it does really require us to think about how we centre social justice within this space, and that means thinking about different types of economic systems, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. Any last thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry, Chris.
No, you go, Chantal.
No, I would just jump in and say, yeah, I think what we're dealing with here is very much an energy system that was very much set up around the market when it was sort of moved across from state ownership into that market system. We really need to challenge that. I think there's been some fantastic work out there. The First Nations Clean Energy Network is extraordinary in the work that they're doing on the ground across Australia. Lots of collaboration in that space. So I think there's some really positive things happening, but it's being driven from the ground up, which is important. It's important to support. I think it's important for institutions and governments to support that work as it's already happening, being driven from community.
Thank you so much, Chantal. We're going to have to wrap up there, and I think that it is so, as that's all we have time for. I'd really like to thank Crystal, Chantal, Chris, Sonia, and Nicole for joining us this afternoon and for such a thoughtful discussion. Thank you to you, our audience. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion. This event was recorded, so everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording through their email. And I'd like to thank the team that put this together, particularly Jill and Carly. Their work is fantastic, and I look forward to you joining the next Luminaries in a fortnight's time. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for joining us.